Alright, so I was gonna do some sort of let's play of some short horror game for some Halloween because I figured why not do it this year? Couldn't find something worth playing or something that wouldn't take me like all day to do, so instead we'll just rank some old horror games. This will mostly be classic games that weren't part of some sort of well known series like Resident Evil, so there won't be Resident Evil or Silent Hill on this list, or Doom, or Fear. Mostly stuff from the 90s, mid 2000s. And I'll start by mentioning Sweet Home, because this was a reference. This was the inspiration for Resident Evil and modern survival horror in general. I have never played it. I would like to sometimes, as there is a translation patch, but it doesn't look like it's exactly new user friendly. But then again, it is an NES game, but worth mentioning. So I'm hoping to play it at some point so I can actually comment on it sometime. But the first game I actually am going to rank is Obscure. This was I want to say mid-generation PS2 and Xbox game. This is a bit hard to comment on. Like, I have played it several times, but it's definitely chasing the Resident Evil type survival horror, but it's got like a very teen approach to it, which I guess is okay. Apart from like one character who's always saying dog, the writing isn't too terrible. Granted, I was using the least combat effective characters in that because like the two that are combat effective, I can't stand. Which, by the way, you can use multiple characters in this, and it does have a bit of a co-op element because you take two characters out at once, and one person can control the second character, or you can just let the AI control it, which is definitely different because the only other game that really did classic survival horror in a co-op sense was Resident Evil Outbreak. But anyways, for that, I'll give it a B. Not particularly scary, but it definitely plays like a proper survival horror. Its sequel, however, not so much. Oh boy, this took the writing and definitely teen to fight out with the college setting, so it's like, it is cringe. And the story itself is also pretty bad. Kills off almost all the new returning characters. Kills off all the new characters. And the ending is just okay. What was the point of that? I don't know. Maybe that's the point of horror, but I didn't enjoy it. Plus, the gameplay really just went downhill from the first one. That's definitely D tier. Now, Fatal Frame is somewhat well known, but I'm going to throw it on there anyway because I'm not going to make a list specifically for it. And I don't know anyone else has played them. But of these obscure games, this one's definitely my favorite series, with the first one being an automatic A tier. It really isn't that scary, but it was nice to do something with ghosts for a change instead of freaking zombies. And it wasn't gore heavy. So it was actually trying to be scary instead of just cheap jump scares. The setting was pretty interesting, a Japanese mansion instead of a Western one. And before Weebism, no, it's just because it's different. The story is pretty decent, there's a lot of side things you can do, and there's also an Xbox port that had a bunch of new content, including a different ending. So if you're going to play that one, I would suggest playing the original Xbox version if you can, although unfortunately MS, being the liars they are, decided to axe the backwards compatibility program, so that's forever locked on the console, but otherwise, you can play the PS2 version. Same thing with Fatal Frame 2, although this one seems to be the fan favorite, and I never understood why. I can only guess it's because either A, nobody played the first one but heard about it and jumped into the second one, kind of like what happened with Silent Hill, so therefore it's the best game ever. It does have probably the darkest story out of all of them, but I don't know, I didn't like it as much as one. I didn't say that's the top of B for me. It's still pretty good, but it just didn't hold the candle to one. or 3 for that matter. Now 3 took everything that I liked about the first one and intensified it. The story wasn't as good, but it was definitely messed up. The combat, which by the way I never touched on that. Another reason the way it made this series good is just using a camera to capture ghosts in ways to fight them, and then using different film types as ammo, and better ones being better ammo. So, you essentially had your handgun, shotgun, magnum, but instead of it being bullets, it's different film grades. But anyways, this one took the combat and made it, and really perfected it. It's also the scariest. Like, this one will throw some scares at you that will sometimes happen, and sometimes they will. I had one instance where I walked into a closet under some stairs, and then the door locked behind me, and some creepy shit happened, and I have never been able to get that to happen again. And I've replayed the game at least twice. So for that, I'm giving it an S tier, because it's my favorite in this series and one of the best games on this list. Unfortunately, the fourth game, not so much. It sort of follows the original formula, but it slows it down. There's less ghosts. The area you explore just feels smaller, but you're going through it over and over again. The story is just okay. The combat's still fairly decent, but this one was just a bit too slow. And unfortunately, it was never released outside Japan until the remaster. I have not played the remaster. I've only played a fan translation version of the original Wii game. It controls alright, and I guess it's okay for being what it is, but I'm just saying it's a middle-of-the-road game. And then the fifth game in the franchise, I have mixed feelings about. It's definitely more intense than the fourth game was, which is good. And trigger warnings for anyone who's sensitive to this thing. It does touch heavily on the topic of suicide. And I think it's based heavily on Suicide Forest in Japan, which, given the fact that you're in said forest, even though it's like not the actual forest, instead of just it's the same mansion setting, does freshen it up a bit. And just how dark the game is, just for being so revolving around the concept of suicide, does make it a bit freshen it up and make it interesting. I have played the Wii U version, which you essentially use the gamepad like a camera and move it, tilt it like you would a camera. It was pretty different. Like, I am cheating a bit with this game because this is definitely not mid-2000s, but it is part of the series. I've not played the Switch version, but I would put this as a high B, maybe an A. But the problem with this game is there's such a low variety of ghosts, you end up finding the same ones over and over and over again. But I think the tone and the setting and the writing, I think it deserves maybe the bottom of B. I don't know. I'll have to play the remaster one of these days. There is technically a side game in this series called Spirit Camera, but I'm not going to bother with it, since I don't think anyone's played it, and you need to have an external accessory to even play it on the 3DS. It's an AR game, it's short as shit, and nobody cares. If I was ranking it, I'd probably put it in an F. But Run Like Hell on the PlayStation 2. This is a sci-fi one. This one's probably a bit more action-focused than some of these games. Unfortunately, it's very buggy, and the action is not particularly good. It pulls a lot of cheap things like enemies dropping on you from the ceiling and having no time to react. So, from a gameplay perspective, I would put this in D. However, I do appreciate the story and the fact that they managed to stretch it out as long as they did and keep it interesting. And the fact that there's, like, non-hostile alien characters in a horror game. And one of them is actually voiced by the chick that plays Janeway in Star Trek Voyager. So that's a plus. For its setting alone, I'll give it a low C, but that game is a really rough play. And then there's a couple of Evil Dead games. Most people probably know that stupid asymmetrical horror game that nobody asked for. Well, there's some old survival horror games that nobody asked for. I'm pretty hit and miss on the films. I think the first one was decent. The second one was good, though retconning the first one was kind of stupid. The third one was a bit too outlandish, though I know a lot of people like it for whatever reason. Unfortunately, the first game on the PlayStation 1, an absolute mess. Like, they tried to replicate Resident Evil, but the controls are terrible, the cameras are terrible, and worst of all, enemies respawn. And it's not like respawn when you leave the area. No, I swear they respawn when you just leave the screen. So, finite amount of health and ammo, but a shit ton of enemies that are always respawn and are not worth fighting. So your only choice is to really run and only fight when you have to, which, I guess if you like the sword and run and hide thing, power to you, but the game is not balanced worth a shit. F tier that goes. The second one is a bit better, by putting it in a city setting, but it still has a lot of issues. It still has respawning enemies, but it's not near as egregious as the first game was. The story is pretty much trash. And it does kind of follow up on the PlayStation game, so you kind of had to play it. I don't know. I think that both the Evil Dead games are D tier. In that order, too. Because the third game is probably the most refined, but it's short as all hell. And the midget zombie that follows you around just, like, makes it impossible to take it seriously. Which, I get it. It's Evil Dead. It's not meant to be taken seriously. But that one's a bit too over the top. Now, Siren. I have some interesting feelings for this one. On one hand, it's not particularly scary, but the atmosphere is top notch. This is made by the creator of Silent Hill. And I think that should speak for itself. It's got a good story, an interesting set of characters. But the problem is the episodic format. Every little piece of the game is played through episodes, but the problem is you have to play through them multiple times to find hidden side objectives to advance the story, and it is very, very vague sometimes of what these side objectives are, and sometimes it won't even unlock them until you reach certain points, so you constantly have to go back and redo these episodes. Plus, at the beginning, it's overly tedious, because most weapons... Man, I am not doing well today. Most characters don't have weapons until later in the game, and even some never get them at all. Which, you may be thinking, well, that's the point, but the thing is even characters with weapons, you can only stun the enemies for like a couple of minutes. You can't kill them. So your best option is still to avoid enemies, but not having the option to defend yourself really sucks. And the sight jacking mechanic doesn't really help very much. So the forest areas where you have a lot of wiggle room aren't too bad, but some of the indoor ones where you don't have a weapon, like the school, oh man. Do you get screwed on that? I think it's an A tier game for its atmosphere and its uniqueness, but be aware that that is a really tedious play. It was remade to make it more accessible, bringing some things from the second game and ditching the episode mechanic. But the problem is it was released in an episodic format despite that. And it also heavily westernizes it. Like, most of the characters are actually American now for some reason. Retcons the original story, destroys the atmosphere. That shit goes in F tier. Maybe not as bad as Evil Dead. But man, do not play that. Granted, you can only play it either by importing a Japanese copy or downloading it from PSN, which I'm not even sure it's for sale on there anymore, but just don't. The sequel, unfortunately, only ever came out in Europe and Japan, so no American copies. So you'll have to either have a modded PS2 or play that one as you can. Uh, it does make some improvements from the first game, and unfortunately keeps the episode structure, but it's not as tedious as the first game. And also, characters can pick up and discard weapons as they please, so you're not constantly having to run through half the game like you are in the first one. Though there are some characters that will not find weapons. Ammo is extremely scarce. But the problem I have with this one is the story is really weird. Like even comparing it to the first game I can at least understand for the most part. The second one just takes some really weird turns, and not in a good way. It's just like, what the hell just happened? Kind of weird. Still, I would put it as a low B because of that. But if you can play it, it's worth playing. Just again, expect to have to play it on an emulator. Before I get into the Dino Crisis games, there's another one on the PS2 called Extermination, which is very cookie cutter survival horror. I'd say it's somewhere between Run Like Hell and Fatal Frame 4. It's not scary at all. It plays okay, the story's meh. But I guess the way I would describe it is just really inoffensive. If you just want to play a generic survival horror that isn't scary but more action heavy, I guess, while still playing like classic survival horror, go for it, but it's just a meh experience. It's not terrible, but it isn't good. It's just okay. Thankfully, though, it's still pretty cheap. And then we have the Dino Crisis games, and oh boy, are these getting expensive. Glad I picked these all up when I did. The first game is basically Resident Evil with dinosaurs, which honestly I think that is a strength for it and why it's my favorite in the series. The story is kind of... you know what? The story is basically just that, Resident Evil with dinosaurs. But the gameplay is very much classic survival horror, just with raptors instead of zombies. And honestly, those sons of bitches are more of a threat than the zombies are, so it's considerably more difficult. It isn't scary, particularly scary, but just the fact that they were able to make a survival horror with being somewhat scary with dinosaurs, I think gives it an A tier. The sequel, on the other hand, most people love the second one because it's more action heavy. It kind of does its own thing instead of being Resident Evil dinosaurs, but to me that was a weakness. It's an alright game, but I can't even really justify calling this as a horror game anymore. I don't know, enemies constantly respawn, the combat's a lot quicker for better or worse, the story is just weird, because it involves time travel. I don't know, just like, I like it, but it kills the tone of the original. I would say it's a low B. And I know I'm going to piss the fanboys off with that one. I would say play that one as you can, because that one is actually selling for like upper 90s, the hundreds, and it's not worth that. But at least that was still a decent game. Dino Crisis 3, on the other hand, oh man. Oh man, did they screw the pooch with this one. They took it into a space setting, which I would have been okay with. But the problem is the fact that the level design is horrendous. You constantly have to backtrack, which I get it, it's a survival horror trope, but the problem is you constantly have to change the layout of the ship. So I don't know about you, but I can remember where you're supposed to go. I can remember what part is what. And having to constantly change the ship into layouts that don't even make sense, which is stupid. The combat is atrocious. It's definitely faster paced than the previous two games. And yeah, sure, they did something different, but just because it's different doesn't mean it's good. There's nothing good about this game. Yeah, I'm putting that in the F tier, but it's better than Siren Blood Curse, which is kind of sad. And this one is definitely cheating because it's a spin-off, but it's also a light gun game. And if Dino Crisis 2 was not horror anymore, this one definitely isn't, but I'm just throwing it in there because might as well do the entire Dino Crisis series. It's short like a light gun game is. If you're playing it with a gun, it's probably a C tier. A C tier. That if you're not, it's an F tier. The story kind of ends the cliffhanger issue that 2 had, bringing in a certain character back. It doesn't answer the cliffhanger, but at least it kind of sort of undoes it. Unfortunately, it's not in a particularly satisfying way, but hey, if you wanted to at least get a glimpse of how maybe Dino Crisis 3, a proper Dino Crisis 3 would have gone, then knock yourself out. It's pretty cheap, easy to play, but it's really still a D tier game. Parasite Eve. This was kind of an interesting one because this is a survival horror mixed with an RPG. There are random battles. Yeah, random battles in a survival horror game. It's an interesting game, I'm not gonna lie. But, the story is atrocious. The story and characters are all atrocious. Like, it's bad. Even by Square standards. So it's kind of hard to rank this one. Like, if I... Just putting this... I know you really shouldn't be putting the story too heavily on older games, but it's so bad. I have to give it a C tier. I don't know. The interesting blend of role-playing mechanics and survival horror just doesn't really hold it together as much as it should. Great experiment. And it really should have ended there because the sequel, they decided to drop the RPG mechanics and turn it into a regular survival horror. The problem is, the story isn't as atrocious as it was in the first game, but it's not interesting, and the combat is... it's bland. The environments are bland, and it ain't scary. So, act in the D tier you go. And I know I'm going to, again, piss the fanboys off. Well, I'll even put it at the top of D tier, but that's as far as it gets. There is a third game in the series called The Third Birthday, which is kind of more of a reboot, and I think it's best we just don't even talk about that game at all. Because honestly, I'm not even sure it counts as horror. Okay, now we're going to move into something a bit different. Clock Tower. This is where they kind of I think this is the birthplace of the whole run and hide type horror, which I'm not a fan of. Like, I get why some people like it. Not being able to fight does make it a bit more tense and maybe more scarier, but the whole point of a horror game is to invoke fight or flight. When you're forcing one or the other, it just kind of cheapens the experience. That's kind of why I like Doom 3 and Fear. Like, just don't really cut it as far as that regard. Like, Fear is an excellent game, but the fact that it's constant fighting kind of kills it, even though it's not even that scary to begin with as a horror game. It's a great first-person shooter, but as a horror game, not so good. But anyways, on the other side of the spectrum, I blame this game for the current trend of run and hide games. Granted, it's the one to really blame is Amnesia: The Dark Descent, but the fact that this birthed it in the first place does not spare it. I really hate those games. They're boring. They have no replay value, and they rely entirely on being scary and having a story, which if they fail at that, there's nothing worth there being for. Whereas a classic survival horror, like, say, I don't know, Fatal Frame, if you don't find it scary, if you hate the story, there's still the combat there to make it a decent game. They could save it as a game. I've only played the original Clock Tower. It's okay. For run and hide, it's actually pretty decent, but I'd say it's somewhere between Parasite Eve and Fatal Frame 4. I've never finished it. I should probably go back and do that, but yeah, for its time, it was pretty different. It wasn't like, it didn't come from the era of being oversaturated run and hide games like Outlast. Unfortunately, I never played 2 and 3. I should probably fix that at some point. I know a lot of people look fondly on 2, but I think 3 is kind of mixed. But another run and hide game is Haunting Ground. This one I have mixed feelings on. On one hand, the story is bland, it's not particularly scary, and it's another run and hide. However, it had some very unique mechanics. You get a companion, a dog, and depending on how you treat the dog, depends on how useful the dog is. If you treat him well and reward his good behavior, then he'll be more likely to stun enemies or do things you want him to. But if you're mean to him, he won't do it. And there's also crystals that you can use as the last line of defense that act as landmines. You can't kill anything, but you can stun the thing that's following you. So it definitely leads into the run and hide camp, but at least gives you a little bit to defend yourself between the dog and the gems. I am not sure where to rank this one though, because again, the problem is it's not scary, and the quote-unquote monsters you run with are basically just humans. Hell, one of them is just a dude with a gun. Yeah, real scary. Atmosphere is pretty alright. Yeah, I think it deserves the top of C just for being unique. Now we have something that's, ooh boy, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth. I'm going to say straight up, if this game was polished, I'd put it in an A. However, it is a buggy mess, especially the PC version. It's also on the Xbox, but good luck finding that. You can get the PC version on GOG, which I recommend because there was a little bit of tweaking to make it run on modern PCs, but you'll still probably need the unofficial community patch. That's kind of bad if you need unofficial community patches to make this thing playable, because the bugs would probably bring it back down to C. Hell, if you're playing it without the patch, it's just literally unplayable, because it will not work on modern PCs. There'll be crashing bugs, and there's a point in the game where you literally cannot progress it because you can't see enemies within the fog that you're supposed to shoot with a cannon. However, I'm going to put this between Fatal Frame and Obscure. If it was less polished, it would go into the A tier. But as it is, B, just make sure you get the GOG version and the community patches. But I fully recommend it. It's not the scariest thing ever, but it's got atmosphere, it's got storytelling, it's got classic survival horror survival elements while in the first person. And speaking of first person, we got something that it actually could do both. The Suffering. A game that takes place in a prison, but all the horror elements revolve around said prison. A lot of the enemies are based on methods of execution in this game. Like, the very first one you come across is based around beheading, and then you'll come across others that represent lethal injection, the firing squad, hanging. Yeah, the setting alone and the interesting way they handle the enemies to go inside with said setting give it a great atmosphere. The problem is that it's not particularly scary. It's more of a shooter than a survival horror. But hey, again, it lets you play in first and third person. The story is okay. The only problem I have is the characters are cringe. Like, it leans heavily into stereotypes. And yeah, I get it's a prison and most of the inmates are like hardened killers, but it's just like some of these people are beyond stupid. But it's a solid B tier of a game. I would say, yeah, low B tier. Some of these ones are just better. Unfortunately, the sequel ruined it. The story is atrocious. It no longer has interesting enemies based around executions. Like, they changed mainliner to represent drug overdose. The ending is just stupid. I don't know what to say about this game. It's a buggy mess. There's no reason to play it. The only reason I'm sparing it with the F tier is because those F tier games are just like atrociously bad, whereas this game's just bad. And then we have a game that's just okay, Cold Fear. It's very much like Extermination, just generic survival horror, not particularly scary, short. It's cheap though. I can't remember. This game does let you properly aim instead of using like old survival horror snapping aim, and it does have a dynamic camera. I don't remember if it's over the shoulder or not, but it does. It did do the laser sight thing before Resident Evil 4 did. But beyond that, it's just an okay game. I'd say it's probably better than Extermination. And then we have The Thing, another game that's just okay. Okay, I'm gonna say I absolutely love the movie. That being the not the black and white original, but the I think it was a '90s movie or early 2000s. I don't remember which. The remake is atrocious. Do not see it. But the original, that game was something truly scary. Like it revolves around just people being essentially taking over. I don't know if it's being taken over or copied. I can never figure that one out. But either way, humans not knowing whether or not there is a monster within their peers, and then once that betrayal happens and the monster comes out, they get torn apart. And just think of having to like watch your best friend just get torn apart by this hideous monster, and then you have to kill it, and it only gets killed by fire. Like guns just stun it, and the only thing that can kill it is fire. So imagine seeing your friends get torn apart and then just having to burn the damn thing to death, and hoping you even have the resources to burn it. It's a truly chilling movie, and taking place in the Arctic. Yeah, how many horror movies take place there? The game, unfortunately, does not. It just does not represent the movie well. It's another C tier game. I would say it's the bottom of it though. They could have done so much more, I think, if they had more development time. But all of the quote unquote betrayals are scripted. Like, I even tested this. There is a guy that will turn on you. I gave him the blood test before the area where he turns, and it came up clean. Walked into the room, and then he turned on me. So yeah, make of that as you will. I was really disappointed in the game. It's not atrocious or particularly bad. It's just really meh. You know, I'm gonna even put that as the top of D tier. Undying. That can take. You know what? That can take the Thing's place in the bottom of C. This one's also more of a shooter than a survival horror, but it's got atmosphere, but it's an interesting story, but it's ugly. It's not particularly fun to play. It's buggy. It's just not a game people particularly look back fondly from what I remember. I've only played through it once, and I have no desire to play it again. It's just an okay experience. If I would only recommend playing it if you're looking for something you might have missed. Now, Eternal Darkness, on the other hand, this is a GameCube exclusive. This is very much traditional Silent Hill survival horror, but it does something which I don't normally like in that kind of setting. It has you jumping around between multiple characters and multiple time frames, but that's also its strength. There's times where you'll be in a World War I hospital, times where you'll be in an ancient Roman tunnels. It keeps it fresh. The story is interesting. It's definitely got a very Cthulhu-y vibe to it, while maintaining a classic survival horror gameplay, limited resources. Got a good variety of weapons. Sometimes you'll be fighting with melee weapons, other times you'll have firearms, depending on the time setting. There's a couple times, though, where you're just, like, walking around and nothing happens in the modern setting, which does slow the pacing down a bit, but honestly, that's the only issue I have with it. Hell, it's even got a unique difficulty selection, where instead of, like, easy, normal, and the hard, you have to select a strength and a weakness, though I don't like how the game doesn't tell you that. However, which deity you choose to align with determines the game's difficulty, and it also changes how the story plays out. and it changes how the characters, I guess, handle the situations they're in. It also changes which final boss you get, so it does encourage replay value in playing on the different difficulty settings. It's a unique game, it's a fun game, it's a scary game, it's got a great story. Maybe not as good as Fatal Frame 3, but it's the only other thing on this I'd consider S tier. Now, next is Kuon, a game that's made by the people that made the Dark Souls series, which I am not into, I will say straight up. I didn't like it. It's not because I'm not into Dark Souls, it's just because it's got atmosphere, but it's really tedious playthrough. I would say this is like a mid D. And what's crazy is the price is just insane for it. Maybe it's just because it's rare, but it's not fun. It's not particularly interesting. It's ugly, and it isn't scary. The atmosphere is the only good point about it. I actually did a video on this next one, Nosferatu. This one is like semi-roguelike, because each playthrough will be somewhat different, though there are things that are just... Who's pinging me? There are things that will be just straight up. It's not particularly scary, but... The way it's handled with the elements of the castle being randomized, or rather the layout's the same, but mostly the same, but the placement of enemies, allies, and weapons is somewhat random. The story is kind of messed up, if you think about it, because it involves going to a wedding and then vampire trying to like drink your sister's blood to resurrect the... I don't even remember what it's trying to resurrect actually, but yeah. Gameplay, it's clanky. It's kind of buggy. It's very ugly. But if you want a unique survival horror experience with some roguelike elements that doesn't actually turn into a roguelike, because you can save, then I would definitely recommend it. It's the bottom of a B, but it's a pretty alright game. And then lastly is something you probably nobody thought was a survival horror. A mech game. Or rather a mecha game, because it leads more towards Gundam than, say, Mech Warrior, with how these things handle. You know, the kind of bullshit where they're flying around, swinging melee weapons. Very Gundam-y. But the funny part is, despite that motif, they didn't nail the atmosphere, or rather, they didn't nail the mechs themselves with that, because they're slow. Unless you use the drive setting, which essentially turns it into a transformer. But the reason this is a survival horror is it starts off with you fighting robots, but it devolves into, well, monsters. Or zombies piloting vehicles. Yeah, I never thought I'd see the day of a mecha game being a survival horror. However, there's a very serious problem with that. And the reason why it's going into D tier between The Thing and... No, I'm putting that between Kuon and Parasite Eve. The dialogue is atrocious. And what's worse is the voice acting. Now, I'm usually the type to play games with dubs over subs, because I'm not one of those weebs that think Japanese voice acting is always the best. It's not. But this is one case where I would have made an exception if the option was there, because the English dub is the worst I've ever heard in my freaking life. Like this, I've only seen horror stories of a certain other game I can't remember the name of, the voice acting being like the worst thing ever, but for the ones I've actually played, this one's definitely the worst. And what's even worse, you can't skip cutscenes. And there's a lot of cutscenes. You're constantly getting interrupted by these guys that won't shut the hell up. Like, you'll walk a couple of steps, get called, be interrupted, having to listen to the yapping, walk a couple of steps, called again, listen to the yapping. Oh, hey, a monster, I'm going to shoot it. Nope, you're going to get called. Here's some yapping before you get to kill it. Ugh. It's worth a playthrough, despite that. However, it's just the atrocious dialogue makes it really hard to get to, and it has absolutely no replay value because of it. If you're interested in this setting alone, a sci-fi mech game that's mixed with survival horror, then play through it on an emulator or something, and then put it away and never look at it again. Anyways, these are some classic survival horror games. Just kind of some stuff that most people probably overlooked and aren't part of a larger series. Probably the only thing I really got on here that's well known as Dino Crisis and Fatal Frame, maybe Parasite Eve. But yeah, some of these I'd recommend, some of these I don't. But if you're looking for a quick thing to play on Halloween, there you go. Yeah, I know this tier list kind of sucked, but it's just something I threw together at the last minute, so my apologies on that.